Okay. So it is 1:03, so we will call this meeting to order. And I will begin with a quick roll call of the Subbasin Committee members. And this will just be within the action minutes. Again, this meeting is completely optional and informational, but we're just doing roll call for our record. Amezquita?
Yeah.
Berentios? Bun?
Here.
Shaban? Chapin Hodges?
Yes, here.
Clark? Francione?
Yeah. Hold on.
Granillo? Lee? Pereira? Adcock?
Here.
Bramers?
Here.
Lore? Hello. McIntyre? Nunes? Penziera Allen?
Here.
Penziera Ron? Pereira? Rice? Smith?
Here.
Esfahanian?
Here.
Malone? Bean? Breen? Brennan? Coppernall? I got you. Hardgrave?
Present.
Stefani? Jakes? Bailey? Oh, you go. Okay, Bailey? Bloom? Crank? Kramers?
Here.
Lipe?
Here.
Matoiso? Okay, and we've got Smith. Okay, thank you. Did any other Subbasin committee members join while I was taking roll?
And Emily, I just want to confirm, do we have a quorum?
Of any one Subbasin committee? No.
Okay, so we can just hold this as a public presentation. Questions can be asked, but no action can be taken during this presentation. And the meeting minutes should reflect that quorum was not reached.
Okay.
Okay.
Wasn't this presented as a workshop anyway? Emily, didn't you just say that, or did I mishear
Yes.
that?
Yeah, but it's if there was a quorum, we would, well, I guess Marina can explain. If there was a quorum, we would just have to note it for the record, but still we wouldn't be taking any action.
That's right. If there was a quorum, then it'd be considered a formal meeting. So anyway, thank you.
Great. Thank you, Marina. And I think if any other Subbasin committee members just join, please let me know. It's like Tom, I didn't get you. Tom Francione, I've got you now. Okay. And then now, do we have any comments from members of the public on the item on the agenda? Okay, I don't see any raised hands. Okay. So we have Derek Williams today presenting from Montgomery and Associates on sustainable management criteria. And I think, Derek, if you could let us know what the best way to raise hands and ask questions, I'll be helping to monitor for raised hands and as we go through your presentation. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Sure. Thank you very much, Emily. And this presentation is not long. It's only 22 slides, so we should get out of here early. So if you can save your questions, that's fine. But if you do need clarification, please do raise your hand. And if you want to know how to raise your hand, if you are a panelist, if you click at the bottom of your screen, there's a picture that says panelists, and you open a window. And I believe there's a raise hand option in there. Is that correct? Am I close? I was close.
Participants. Yeah. So
Yeah, okay. So you should be able to raise your hand. If you don't raise your hand immediately, that's fine. Like I say, I only have about 22 slides. We'll get to the end fairly quickly. I'll take any questions you want at the end there. Be happy to talk about all sorts of things. So let's see here. Let's see. And I'm going to ask you if I'm sharing the correct screen right now. Does it look like there is a presentation on the screen, maybe? Something like that. Does it look like a presentation to you, or does it show my notes?
We've got it. Presentation.
Shows like a presentation. Good. I'm getting better with this two-screen concept. So today I'm going to be talking about sustainable management criteria. This is a workshop that is a complement to the subcommittee meetings that have been happening. We have had 3 subcommittee meetings so far, 3 sub-basin committee meetings, sorry, not subcommittees, sub-basin committee meetings to discuss sustainable management criteria for individual sub-basins. And those committee meetings focus a little more on the information that's available for the sub-basin and what information each sub-basin might start considering when they talk about the sustainable management criteria. This presentation is a broader overview. It has some information in it that some people will have seen before. There are a few slides that I've thrown in there that are new that I want people to pay attention to because they kind of clarify some concepts easily and might simplify our SMCs. So even if you've seen part of this presentation before, there are some slides that are going to simplify some things for us, hopefully. As I mentioned, the other, the sub-basin committee meetings, we have presented some information to you about what data you should be thinking about to set SMCs. We are going to be sending out more data to you in the near future so you can think about the SMCs and a survey that follows that. But this presentation isn't about the actual data. It's about the concepts of what SMCs are, how they work together, and so how you should be thinking about what you are actually saying when you say, this is our minimum threshold, this is our measurable objective. That's what we're going to be talking about. As I say, we're going to talk about the basic concepts, goals, thresholds, objectives, minimum interim milestones. I'm going to give some examples to let you think, this is the way we could think of these. I'm going to talk about how all these terms eventually link together because that's important. It is not a linear process. And I'm going to have some important ideas about the timing of undesirable results. That comes about halfway through the presentation. And that's the issue that's some slides that probably you haven't seen before, but it might help clarify and simplify our discussions. So the first point to remember is that setting these criteria is not a linear process. It is, I'm going to present it in a linear way, but all of these terms link together. So you will probably set a threshold, you will talk about an objective, you'll talk about an undesirable result, and then you might realize, boy, the threshold didn't really work for you, and you might have to go back to it. That's perfectly fine. I bring this up because when we are starting to ask for your input on thresholds and objectives, it's going to be important that you give a first impression, that you tell us, based on what I know, this is what I'd like to see as our minimum threshold. If we say, great, we'll go forward with it, and 2 weeks later you come back and say you changed your mind, that's fine. This is an iterative process, but we need to get it started. So don't think that it's terribly linear. It is not. So what are the SMC components? One is the sustainability goal. That's one thing I'm going to talk about. Now, this is a descriptive. This is a couple paragraphs, and I'll talk about it in a minute. It is the big picture. It is a description. It is basically a small executive summary of what sustainability is. It says, this is what we're shooting for. And it's very generalized. We aren't going to spend much time on this. It's something I'll talk about. Not much time will be spent on it. The other things, there are 6 sustainability indicators, and you're all familiar with those. And by a sustainability indicator, I mean it's something that we are going to be measuring, something we are going to be tracking to say, are we sustainable? There are 6 things we track to prove sustainability. Each one of these sustainability indicators has a number of terms that go with it. So every sustainability indicator, we will describe what is significant and unreasonable. And that is a descriptive, that's qualitative. And I'm going to talk about all these, but I'm just showing how they all link together. Those are qualitative. Minimum thresholds, undesirable results, measurable objectives, and interim milestones are all numerical. They're all quantitative. And they all come out of what is significant and unreasonable. So this is kind of the format. For each one of those indicators, we give a description of what we want to see, and then we start setting numerical goals and limits based on that descriptive, qualitative description. So I'm going to go through each one of these terms now, and at the end try and wrap it all up so it all makes sense. The idea is you understand each term individually, and you understand how they relate to all the other terms. The first one I'm going to talk about is the sustainability goal. As I said, it is effectively a short executive summary of sustainability. It comes in 3 parts. The first part is the statement of the goal, and that's what I think of as the mom and apple pie statement. So we will have a 2 or 3 sentence paragraph that says we are going to manage our groundwater for the benefit of agriculture and the environment and municipalities and the future economic growth of the region, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we lay out our general, the general concepts that are important to us in the mom and apple pie part. It's a quick statement saying this is what we are committed to. The next 2 part talks about the measures that we're going to implement to ensure that we get to sustainability and how it will look in the future. Those last 2 parts we cannot write until we've already written the GSP, because we have to know what measures we're taking and we already have to know what our goal is. So that's why I say this is like a short executive summary. We will say this is our overarching feeling. This is what our commitment is with our commitment statement. And then once we get to the end of our GSP and we know what our projects and actions are, we will say we are going to get to our commitment by doing these things. That's why I say the sustainability goal is a kind of an executive summary. If you read the regulations, they talk a lot about the sustainability goal. And the way the regulations are written, it sounds like we should write the goal and then write everything around it. That's not the way it's actually done. What happens is you figure out exactly what you're going to do and then say it all rolls up into a sustainability goal. So remember that we're going to come to the goal at basically at the end of the project. That's why I'm not going to spend much time on it. So we're going to spend more time on these 5 concepts: significant and unreasonable, minimum thresholds, undesirable results, measurable objectives, and interim milestones. And I'll go through each one of those independently. And pardon me, as I mentioned, we set these for each of the 6 sustainability indicators. That's one of the reasons these projects take so long. We've got to set up the entire thing 6 times. Let's talk about what's significant and unreasonable. Remember, significant and unreasonable is a qualitative description, a descriptive statement. It is what we want to avoid. So in the regulations, it says you have to consider and document the conditions that are significant and unreasonable. That's what we're going to be doing. These are descriptive or qualitative statements that describe what should be avoided. And so if you remember for the 3 subbasins where I have already had the SMC talk, and next week we're going to give the SMC presentation that corresponds to this in the East Side and Forebay, I believe. Is that right, Emily? East Side, where are we doing? What are next
Upper
week's-
Valley.
Upper Valley, I'm sorry. I'm losing track of all my meetings. East Side and Upper Valley next week. Okay. You will notice in that presentation, when I gave examples of what we could do, I always said that we could say, for example, this is significant and unreasonable, and it would lead to these thresholds and objectives. I always start with the qualitative statement. So some examples of those, of what you might say. I'm giving examples of how you might think of these. You might say groundwater elevations below your pump or below the pump in my well. That would be significant and unreasonable. Or you could say groundwater elevations in a number of wells, in a number of years. All of those years, the groundwater levels were significant and unreasonable. We don't want to return to those. You could say for the amount of groundwater in storage indicator, the first 2 were for groundwater elevation indicators. Remember, we got to do this for 6 indicators. For the groundwater and storage indicator, you might say pumping more groundwater than is available is significant and unreasonable. That's a pretty easy thing to say, actually. Pumping more than we have is a bad idea. Probably a good thing you want to say. What you're effectively saying is exceeding the sustainable yield is significant and unreasonable. For subsidence, you might say any subsidence is significant and unreasonable. And if you've been through the presentations, if you're one of the 3 groups that have been through the presentations, you know we have some options on that. We could say any subsidence that impacts infrastructure is significant and unreasonable. Or 3 inches of subsidence a year, more than 3 inches is significant and unreasonable. Could take a lot of approaches. I'll get back to that one in a minute. I'll convince you the answer is 0, but that's a whole different thing. So these are the types of things you want to be thinking about when we say what for each one of these 6 sustainability indicators, what is significant and unreasonable. You want to be thinking about a qualitative statement like this. It tells us what we want to avoid, and it drives our minimum thresholds and measurable objectives. If we know these qualitative statements, the significant and unreasonable, we can jump to minimum thresholds. So if you remember, the first bullet here says groundwater elevations below the pump in my well is significant and unreasonable. If we took that as an example and said, what's the minimum threshold? This cute little drawing I made here shows your well, and the little blue mark here in the middle, that is where your pump is. That's your pump intake. And we don't want water levels to drop below that. So we would say this dashed line might be our minimum threshold. We always then, what we're saying is we don't want groundwater levels to drop below that. The minimum threshold is the quantitative number that talks about what's significant and unreasonable. So we would go out to your well, we would say, you know, your ground elevation is 304 feet and the top of your pump is at 112 feet. We don't want groundwater elevations to drop below 114 feet mean sea level. So we would have a quantitative value that relates to our what's significant and unreasonable, and we would set it at your well there. Now we don't set it for everybody's well. We only set it for the representative monitoring wells. And when you see the monitoring chapter that will be coming out soon, every basin will have a set of 24 representative monitoring wells, and we will be setting this minimum threshold at each one of those. And if you would like your well to be a representative monitoring well, let us know. We'd be happy to include it, and we will set a minimum threshold and a measurable objective at your well there, which is kind of an advantage because that means we are managing the basin to your property to make sure your property is the one that's being managed sustainably. So big take home, minimum thresholds, they're quantitative and they're based on what's significant and unreasonable. One thing to note, and we're going to come back to this, if groundwater levels should drop below the minimum threshold, that's not necessarily an undesirable result. And this is where the tricks of the language start to show up here. And it's why the language becomes important. When I get to the definition of undesirable result, you'll see why. But it's not necessarily true that if you said we don't want to drop our water level below your pump, and if we accidentally do it, we might end up saying that's not an undesirable result. This is something we'll get back to, and I want to make sure everybody's clear about by the end of this meeting. Additional examples of what minimum thresholds will be. So for subsidence, we could say the minimum threshold is 0. 0 is the quantitative number. And remember, minimum thresholds are 0. It's based on the statement of significant and unreasonable that any subsidence is significant and unreasonable. So this is where I'm showing you how we're making the connection. We originally said any subsidence is significant and unreasonable. And so the minimum threshold becomes the quantitative value of that 0. For groundwater and storage, we could say the minimum threshold is the estimated sustainable yield of something. We'd throw some number in there. This is based on the significant and unreasonable statement that pumping more than our sustainable yield is significant and unreasonable. So we started with that statement. We started with our statement of we don't want to pump more than our sustainable yield. Then we quantify our sustainable yield and say we are not going to pump more than this on average. Don't get too picky about year by year. In my opinion, Sigma is not designed to manage basins year by year. It's designed to manage basins for long-term sustainability. So if we say the minimum threshold is to pump within our sustainable yield of something, there will be years where we're pumping more and years where we're pumping less, but we're shooting for that long-term average. Another thing that this brings up, which is important, and it gets back to the iterative question, that number, which is now here represented by 4 X's, we can change that as we go forward. And I talked to DWR about this just yesterday. If we say in our original GSP, we are not going to pump more than 124,000 acre feet per year or something like that. And in 2 years, we realized, gosh, we could pump more and still be within our sustainable yield. We could pump 128,000. It is not difficult to change that number. We still have the same concept of sustainability, that we are pumping within our sustainable yield. And that's the core concept that we want to keep. That number will be able to change going forward. So don't get hung up too much on making sure that number is exactly right. Get hung up more on the concept of pumping within or outside your sustainable yield. So those are some examples of minimum thresholds and how they relate. Hopefully you see how they relate to our statements of significant and unreasonable. Now remember I said if we drop water levels below the level of your pump, and if we drop water levels below a minimum threshold, it might not be undesirable. It might not be by itself an undesirable result. And that gets to the definition of undesirable results. This is where it gets a little more complicated. Undesirable results are a combination of minimum threshold exceedances that end up in significant and unreasonable effects. This is out of the regulations here. Couple things to note. In the orange box at the bottom, avoiding undesirable results is how you prove sustainability. Okay, we're going to have a sentence for each one of the sustainability indicators saying this is our definition of an undesirable result for this indicator. There will be up to 6 sentences. In most basins, there'll only be 5. There will be up to 6 sentences in your GSP. Those 6 sentences define sustainability. That is it. If you can say we are not having any of these undesirable results, then by definition, you are managing sustainably. So the sentence that describes undesirable results is a little important here. Okay? It is a combination of minimum threshold exceedances. And this is where, pardon me, this is where you get flexibility. And I'm going to explain this by giving a couple examples. Instead of trying to explain the words on the page right here, I'm going to give a couple examples, and it'll show what this means by a combination of exceedances. So one example, first example, an undesirable result occurs when 10% of your groundwater elevations, measured in your representative monitoring sites, drop below the associated minimum thresholds. A couple things to notice about this. We have a value, and I have been told by DWR that one thing they're doing when they're reviewing these is they're actually going through the reports and making sure the undesirable result has a value in it. We need a number in there that says this is the combination of minimum threshold exceedances. So this one, the number is 10% of our groundwater elevations. This might be the type, this might be the type of undesirable result we use for groundwater levels. What it does is it gives us some flexibility. What we end up doing is saying, we have set some minimum thresholds, and we understand that in any one year or in any one situation, we might not be able to avoid exceeding the minimum threshold every year. And so we're going to give ourselves a little flexibility. We're going to say we can exceed 10% of them, 15%, something like that. And it cuts both ways. One thing is you get some flexibility in the undesirable by stating this undesirable result, but it also means some people's wells might be going dry, or some people water levels might drop below the pump in some people's wells. So if you make that number too big, 50%, and trust me, in some GSPs I've read, it's a big number. It is a big number. If you make it something like 50%, there's a real question of whether you are really managing to your minimum thresholds or not. Because you're saying, well, we set these thresholds that we don't want to exceed, but really we don't care if half of the basin goes dry. I'm not sure that's passable there. So we want to have some flexibility, but we don't want to make it so flexible that it is unrealistic that we are actually trying to manage sustainably. There is no good guidance on what this number should be. It is something we're going to have to talk about and discuss and find out where people feel comfortable. But remember, undesirable results is something you want to think about when you're setting your minimum thresholds, knowing that you might have some flexibility in those minimum thresholds. A graphical example of what I'm showing here, this 10%, is this. The top, this hydrograph that I'm showing here, the top left one, shows, say, the blue line is our historical water level, and this vertical black line in the middle is today. And so water levels after today rise and stay above this red minimum threshold in most of our wells. But a couple wells, maybe, in the bottom left hydrograph, they are going along, and after today, the water levels kind of stay where they are and they start to drop, and they drop below the minimum threshold. So this hydrograph in the bottom left would be something where we're violating our minimum threshold. We're exceeding our minimum threshold. What we're going to be doing every year when we do this, when we turn in our annual reports, is we chart what is the percentage of wells exceeding the minimum threshold. And remember, our statement was 10% right here. If you can see, can everybody see I'm not sure I'm using my mouse correctly. Can you see my mouse? Anybody nod correctly? Okay, Emily's nodding, so I guess my mouse is showing up. This, in our previous statement, we said 10%. If we exceed that, it's undesirable. And so this is an example. We start in 2040. This is for a GSP that was turned in this January. In 2040, maybe 2% of our wells exceed the minimum thresholds. We aren't doing so well. They keep going up, and eventually in about 2046, 12% of our wells are exceeding their minimum thresholds. We're having an undesirable result. We are not managing sustainably. DWR is angry at us, okay? We take some actions, we bring the number of exceedances down to below 10%. After that, after 2049 here, although we have some exceedances, it's always below 10%. After 2049, we are always managing sustainably according to this one indicator. So that's how undesirable results work with minimum thresholds. That's why you want to be thinking about your undesirable result when you set your minimum threshold, because you will have some flexibility. Another example would be an undesirable result occurs when groundwater elevations at any single representative monitoring point drops below the minimum threshold. Basically, we are giving ourselves zero flexibility on this, and that's fine. It might be something for subsidence or seawater intrusion. That's one where you don't want to say, well, we'll average it out. We will average out seawater intrusion. As long as there's not seawater intrusion in half the basin, it's okay to have massive seawater intrusion in the other half of the basin. You probably don't want to say that. So in that case, we would have an undesirable result like this, where basically our flexibility is zero, and the number that we would put in is zero exceedances. I want to talk a little more now about undesirable results and minimum thresholds, because when I've been reviewing other people's GSPs, particularly when it comes to the amount of water in storage and subsidence, people are making it much more complicated than it needs to be. They get wrapped around the axle. They do a lot of odd calculations that, in my opinion, are unnecessary. So I'm going to try, this is the point where, even if you've seen this presentation before, I'm going to try and clarify some concepts, particularly for groundwater storage and subsidence, that are going to hopefully make our life easier going forward. I'm going to start with water levels because everybody understands it, and I'm going to start with something that you're going to say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and then I'm going to go to storage. So the part that you say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, this is a hydrograph. And let's say this is a well, and today the well is measuring 217 feet elevation. That's the groundwater elevation in the well, is 217 feet. And this happens to be the groundwater elevation in the well, it turns out, for the next, what is this, 52 years. That's right, it's 52 years. We adopted the GSP in 2 years. Groundwater elevations are still going down. We've set a minimum threshold, right? We've set a minimum threshold. It turns out here to be 183 feet. Groundwater elevations continue to go down. They go below our objective, and I haven't talked to you about our objective yet, but I'll get to that. It's basically our goal. That's what we're going to shoot for. And we drop below what we're going to shoot for. We drop below our minimum thresholds. But remember, this is our path to sustainability. We have to prove sustainability in 2042. We adopted the GSP in 2022. We have to prove sustainability in 2042. Now, I'm hiding a few things here, but don't worry about them right now. We'll get to other things. If we drop below our minimum threshold in 2030, we are not having an undesirable result. Undesirable results are calculated starting in 2042. We have to show that we have a plan to get to here, but we don't have to be here. We don't have to be above our minimum threshold here in 2030. Because of that, we're not having an undesirable result until we get to sustainability. At this point is where all the calculations for undesirable results start to kick in. The point of this is that when we set our minimum threshold, our measurable objective, and most people understand this, we aren't saying we're going to be at our objective always. We say we're going to be at our objective when we get to sustainability at 2042. And we're going to avoid our minimum threshold after we get to sustainability. That's when we promise to avoid our minimum threshold once we are sustainable. And that's the phrase you want to be thinking about. This is the key phrase that people lose in their mind. That's important. When we reach sustainable, we will either see or not see something. In this case, we are saying when we reach sustainability in 2042, we will not let water levels drop below 183 feet. And most people understand this. They know when they set a groundwater elevation objective, it doesn't mean it's there today and it doesn't mean it's there tomorrow. It means it's there when we get to sustainability. Where people lose track is when we turn this into storage, and then people get lost. Here is the similar graphic for storage. We adopt the GSP in a couple years. The amount of groundwater in storage in our basin is continuing to drop. We're losing groundwater storage. It bottoms out. We implement some brilliant plan. We gain some groundwater storage, and we are sustainable at this point. When you're setting your minimum thresholds, similar to groundwater elevations, this time period doesn't count. Remember, your minimum thresholds, we aren't calculating what's undesirable in this first 20 years. We're calculating what's undesirable once we get to sustainability. So the question then is, well, what does our change in storage look like when we get to sustainability? We aren't seeing any change in storage, which is what we expect because our groundwater elevations are not going up or down. We're maintaining our groundwater elevations. So we're really not seeing any change in storage following 2042. It is fairly flat there. So we don't have to go through lots of calculations to say, what will our change in storage be? We know what it's going to be. We're going to have a long-term change in storage of 0. That's what it's going to be. If we don't have a long-term change in storage of 0, we are saying we are allowing our groundwater levels to continue to decline after sustainability. And I don't think we're going to do that. Remember, after we get to sustainability, our minimum threshold for change in storage is effectively 0 in most cases. It means we're going to pump within our sustainable yield by definition. We don't have to do a lot of calculations to know that. And we don't have to do a lot of calculations because we don't care. Well, we care, but we don't have to take into account in our calculations this first part here. Remember, the statement was, when we reach sustainability, that's what the minimum threshold is and the measurable objective. And so for storage, the question is, when we reach sustainability, we will see really no change in storage. We'll see a lot of change in storage before then. Possibly, possibly not. It's up to us. It all depends on groundwater elevations, which are hard. But storage, once we reach sustainability, I don't think we're going to see a change in storage at that point. People have been doing weird calculations to try and figure out how to calculate this. We don't have to do it. We have to say, when we reach sustainability, we will see no change in storage, or we will pump within our sustainable yield, and we'll be done. It's true no matter what our groundwater levels are. The minimum threshold's 0 for both of these. If we let groundwater levels drop a little way at sustainability, we still have a minimum threshold of 0. We're still pumping within our sustainable yield. If we let groundwater levels drop a long way, we still have no change in storage once we reach sustainability, because this part doesn't matter. All that matters is what's happening in this area. So these are my, this is my discussion. Again, when we reach sustainability, we're going to see, we see the same thing in both of them, that our storage doesn't change in both of them. This is my quick discussion to try and simplify things. It's the same for subsidence. If you are worried that we're going to have 2 feet of subsidence over the next 12 years, well, maybe we might, but when we reach sustainability, we've got 20 years to solve any subsidence problems. When we reach sustainability, our subsidence should probably be 0 at that point, okay? Because it'll go along the same trajectory as this. So hopefully that simplifies things. I'll be happy to talk about this more after this, but hopefully that simplifies some concepts of how you set these minimum thresholds and measurable objectives. Think of them as what life is going to look like after 2040 or after 2042, not what the path there looks like. That'll come up later. I did talk about measurable objectives in those last graphics. Measurable objectives, like I said, are simply our objectives. Since the minimum threshold is something we don't want to drop below, we don't want to manage towards our minimum threshold. We have to manage towards something higher than our minimum threshold. Because if we manage towards it, the first drought that comes along, we're going to drop below it. So we manage towards an objective that's higher than it. And if we manage for an average water level at our objective, then even during a drought, we try to stay above our minimum threshold. So that's the idea of an objective. It gives you some flexibility, gives you some operational room above your threshold that allows water levels to go up and down with the climate there. Now, this last bullet says they must be set in the plan, but it's not enforceable. That's not quite true. Basically, you remember undesirable results when I talked about them. They are a combination of minimum thresholds. And undesirable results are the measure of sustainability, which means minimum thresholds are the underpinning for sustainability, avoiding exceedances of minimum thresholds. Measurable objectives doesn't come into that discussion anywhere. So when you do the actual calculation saying, am I managing sustainably? Your measurable objectives don't come into the discussion. However, in our GSP, we must show that we have a plan to get to our measurable objectives. And every 5 years, we have to show we are making progress towards them. So even though 20 years from now, if we don't hit our measurable objectives, we won't be in trouble for it. 10 years from now, if we are not on a good trajectory to get there, we will be in trouble. So it's kind of a two-edged thing. The measurable objectives aren't strictly enforceable 20 years from now, but we do have to show we have a plan to get there, and we have to show we are on the way to get there. A little odd situation there. Interim milestones, remember I said we have a path. Interim milestones describe the path. They are the path to our measurable objective. They are 5-year markers. They say we know where we're going. So once we decide what our measurable objectives are, we say every 5 years they are going to look like something. In the graphic I showed earlier, which is on the right now, the 3 red dots or the 3 yellow dots would all be interim milestones. We would say, and this is something I sort of glossed over, if we say in our GSP on the blue line, after 5 years we expect to be here, after 10 years, we expect to be here. After 15 years, we expect to be here. And after 20 years, we expect to be back up here. This is the path that we have planned out. And we actually go along that path. When we get down to 15 years, DWR will look at this and say, they're still on their plan. Yes, the amount of water in storage is less than they plan on having in 20 years, but they had planned for it. They had planned for this path. So the interim milestones are what we say, don't worry DWR, we have a plan to get there. I point out that it accounts for planning, CEQA, etc., because we'll probably see a lot of interim milestones that look like nothing for the first 5 years. This is today's condition. 5 years later, we're in the exact same condition because we're still planning our projects and going through CEQA, and we really haven't improved the basin any in the first 5 years. So you can sort of wrap those into your interim milestones, assuming maybe for 5 years you're still doing planning, and then in the last 15, more likely in the last 10 is when the real projects will really kick in. Probably the first 10 years probably won't see that much improvement in our interim milestones. The real improvement will show up in the last 10 years. Of course, you only set these after you understand the projects and actions, because we talk about, well, these are the projects we're going to implement, and it will take 3 years to design the project, another 2 years for CEQA, another 2 years to get through the CEQA lawsuits, and then we will set it out for bid, etc. So you put all those concepts roughly into your interim milestones, and it shows the graph of what you're planning on doing. This is where, remember I said the measurable objectives are not enforceable, but you must show that you're on a path to them. This is the path that you're going to have to show you're on for the next 20 years, that DWR will be watching and saying, are they on the right path to get to their measurable objectives? If we combine everything together, it looks like this. Again, this is this made-up hydrograph where historically we have water levels that are shown in blue here. This vertical line is today. And these are our projected water levels. And we have some interim milestones. We told DWR we are going to sort of go along this linear upward path, actually slightly curving upward path towards our measurable objective. And we're going to avoid minimum thresholds. And sure enough, for the next 20 years, water levels go up and down, but they generally follow that path. and they go up towards our measurable objective, and then we maintain them at that measurable objective for 30 years, and we avoid the minimum threshold for 30 years. That's the big picture of how it's supposed to look. It will not look that way. No basin's going to actually look that way, but in your mind of what you want it to look like, it's just like that there, where every well looks just like that. That's what we're shooting for. That's how it all comes together. So, big picture. This is my last slide. Again, it's an iterative process. All of these concepts are linked. What's significant and unreasonable? It leads to your minimum thresholds. Combinations of minimum thresholds define your undesirable results. Your measurable objectives have to be above your minimum thresholds, and you have to set interim milestones to get to your measurable objectives. All those things are linked, and because of that, we plan on having an iterative process. But to start the iterative process, we need feedback from people saying, this is what's important to me. This is what I consider significant and unreasonable. That's the first step we need to get through. So those are the terms that you'll be hearing a lot. That's how they link together. On these sub-basin committee meetings, I'm not working on the terms as much as talking about the data and the ideas of how you might set these. And as I point out, we're going to be sending out more data to allow people in the sub-basins to look at more data and say, okay, these are my historical water level data. What's important to me? What do I consider significant and unreasonable in these historical data? Or was there anything significant and unreasonable? That's going to be a good question for you. With that, I am happy to take any questions if we've got any raised hands, or if people can raise their hands so Emily can call on you.
Okay. Grant, go ahead.
All right. Hey, Derek. Hey, my question for you, when you were talking about wells that exceed on the groundwater measuring, so you have a basin and you have different wells that you're monitoring, and you're saying, oh, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 wells exceed. Is that weighted, or is there is there some sort of geographic reference to it too? Because I mean, if you have wells on the margin of the basin that are maybe more quickly affected by decreased groundwater and they're smaller wells, how is that as a kind of a point against sustainability if it's a marginal smaller well that's going down?
Good
versus
question.
the larger agricultural well that's in a better spot?
Good question. And the question about kind of clustering of exceedances has come up before. There's not a great way around it, although we have taken some approaches on it. Two things about it. One is the representative monitoring well system, remember, doesn't include all wells. The idea is we set them up to truly be representative of certain areas, and we try not to cluster the representative monitoring wells. So we try to set it up so there's not a cluster of wells on the margin that might all get impacted, just to take care of that one problem there. So that is something we try and do up front. There is also then a question of, should you put in, for the question of undesirable results, do you see one well that is consistently the problem well, or the well that's exceeding its minimum threshold when no other well is? That might indicate either that you're either not managing that one small part of the basin correctly, or you didn't choose a very representative monitoring well in that place. So there are some and there are some other things we've done to look at to try and make sure that undesirable results or minimum threshold exceedances do not cluster in one area compared to another. But it's never going to be perfect. I think, Grant, that's a good thing that when you look at the monitoring system chapter, which we are sending out drafts, we're starting to probably send out drafts this week of the monitoring system chapters for the various subbasins. You should look at the monitoring well distribution and think about that. That is one you ought to be thinking about, thinking, okay, could 2 or 3 of these exceed their minimum threshold and really not have an impact on the basin? And if so, you might say that's not a good monitoring system, or you might say our undesirable result has to have enough exceedances in it to compensate for those potential problem wells, okay? So not a straight answer, but it's a good question without a great answer there, Grant, but it is a good question that we have thought about before, and we do try and get around. Yes.
Thanks, Derek.
Now we have Margaret Coppernow.
Oh, thank you very much. Great presentation. Thank you so much. My questions may seem pretty naive since I'm new at this, but I'm wondering how they determine this 20-year lag before we have to reach sustainability. That's part of my question. The other part is on the graph on the interim milestones, it seems like a drastic drop down and then a sudden hoping to get back up to sustainability. I'm just curious about, how that is happening. It seems such a drastic drop before it can get back up to sustainability in the last 5 years.
Thank you, Margaret. And I will have you know, both of those questions have been discussed and kicked around extensively. So there is nothing about any of these questions that makes you that makes you uninformed. We have chewed on these questions a long time. The 20-year issue was one that was chewed on a lot when the regulations and actually when the legislation was being drafted. There are a number of people who were opposed to it. They were wanting very, very quick sustainability. The truth is, just from my experience and from the experience of most groundwater hydrologists, the time lag it takes to design projects, to implement them, and to see the impact of them in groundwater is very long. There are many basins, in my opinion, that might not even meet that 20-year time frame. It is, although it seems like a long time to many of us, in the groundwater world, 20 years is fast. So, because there is a long time delay between putting in projects and seeing results for one reason. So it was agreed to give us 20 years. And also we don't want to just cut people off. We don't want to be saying, gosh, we've got to reach sustainability tomorrow. Everybody cut back by 30%. That's too bad. We're trying to make it so we are economically viable. That's where it came from. I will admit there are still a number of people who are opposed to the 20-year number. It's the number that got into the legislation as something that might be reasonable. As far as the path to your sustainability, some paths you might be able to say, as you pointed out, one of the paths I showed that we would drop below our minimum threshold and then come back up. That would be an example if, say, we had a large project out there and it's going to take a huge amount of construction. But once we build that large project, it will provide a large amount of water to an area or a subbasin. In that case, we know we're going to build that project, but it's going to take 15 years to design it, permit it, and get it built. And if we think it's going to take 15 years and we simulate it in a model and we say, we can build it in 15 years, and once it starts producing water 15 years from now, it will bring water levels back up quickly. That's the type of situation you saw in that graph, where that first 15 years we are spending time designing it, building it, testing it. If we have a project like that, it's a made up path, but it would be the type of thing where we would spend 15 years doing that. But after 15 years, it's providing a phenomenal, great amount of water, and it allows us to recover our basin. So that would be that situation. It's different if we had a situation where our plan was to, say, slowly ramp down everybody's pumping. Everybody has to ramp down their pumping 2% per year for 10 years or something like that. I made those numbers up. Don't get worried, everybody. I made those numbers up. But if we took that approach, then you would see a different path where you would start at a steep decline and you would slowly even out into a flat, what's called the, it's a ramp down, number there. It's generally referred to as the glide path approach, where you look like you're dropping steeply and then you glide in. That would be the approach for a different project. So it's a project by project sort of approach of how you get to sustainability. Did that answer your question, Margaret?
Oh, yes, sir. Thank you so much. Very enlightening. And thanks again for a great presentation.
Sure.
Okay, now we have Horacio Mesquita.
Hi, Derek. I have some questions. I know that you didn't talk about water quality and one of the undesirable results. And I was wondering how the GSA is going to deal with the degradation of water quality when a drinking water system gets out of compliance. You know, for example, there's water systems that are in 2014 got out of compliance. There's another one from 2016 got out of compliance. Another one in 2018 got out of compliance. How is the GSA going to deal with the degradation of the water quality?
Yeah, thanks, Horacio. I did not discuss water quality because it's a slightly more complicated situation. The water levels are easy to describe as far as what a threshold is and an objective for groundwater levels. Those are easier to conceptually describe. The water quality are a little more difficult, and so I didn't want to get into those details on this presentation, although we will get into those during the SMC discussions with the individual subbasins. And the approach that the GSA will be taking most likely, I do have some options in every subbasin. I give them options for which approach you could take. The approach that we're seeing almost everywhere in the state is to say the GSA will not take actions. Nothing the GSA does will degrade the water quality of municipalities, small systems, anything like that. The GSA is not going to be responsible for any degradation. But on the other hand, the GSA is not going to take on the responsibility of cleaning up somebody else's water quality issues. And we usually take that approach because there are other state agencies and local agencies that already have authority over water quality. So, two-part answer to your question. One, I didn't take it on here because it's a somewhat more complicated question that would just muddle the waters for right now. But also, the second part of that answer is the approach that we're taking generally is going to be to say the GSA will be responsible for its actions and make sure the GSA's actions are not the thing that are causing groundwater quality problems to these municipalities or small systems.
So just to clear up my mind, when does the GSA will be responsible, but when will it take care of the time that a water system gets degraded, when it was established by Sigma or when it was established by the GSA?
It's because the GSA is only taking responsibility for its actions. It's only the only time period that it is concerned about is once it starts to implement actions. Anything before the time that it implements any projects or any actions is not, any groundwater degradation will not be caused by the GSA, and it will be in the responsibility of either the Central Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board or County of Monterey, one of those groups, to be looking at water quality concerns before the GSA takes any actions.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Tom Francione.
Yeah, my question was, who will be deciding where the representative wells will be located?
So you will see a map in our GSPs, and we've developed maps for most of the subbasins by now. We're still, as I say, writing those chapters, but we're starting to roll them out, I think, later this week or such. And you will see a map of the wells. And we have decided it because we looked at which wells we have groundwater level data for, which wells we know enough information about because we have to know the depth of the well, where it's screened, things like that. Which wells have a history of water levels that we can rely on to say, yeah, this is what's happened historically. So we have put together a list of wells that we say we think this makes a good representative monitoring system. It's turning out to be 20, 26 wells per subbasin in that range. When that chapter comes out, if you look at it and you say, I don't like that well, or boy, I would like to add my well in here, it is right here. That is the time when you can get in touch with us and say, I would like to change this. This is, I think we can do better than this, and we'll be happy to change it. Remember, the chapters that come out, we are trying to set them up so they are based on the input from the subbasin committee members, but also we are getting feedback on them. If people say that is not the right way to go, when we're listening to every comment and saying, okay, we can make some changes. So for the actual well locations, Tom, you will see those come out once the chapters start rolling out later this week, next week, times like that. Okay, there'll be a map of them. There'll be a map of them, and there will be a table that identifies the well by state number. Now, we never identify the well by well owner or anything like that. We only identify it by state well number.
Okay, so the sub-basin committees will determine the
Sub-basin committee is more than welcome to weigh in on whether it's the appropriate wells, whether they are the appropriate wells, yes.
Okay.
Okay, do we have any other questions from sub-basin members? Okay, I do see a member of the public, so I'll go over. Oh, Robin, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm having to push the right button here. So I like to take into consideration the minimum threshold for elevation, that there'd be more weight given to residential and urban wells. I think that the way it's been going, it's weighted more toward agricultural needs. But everybody in the valley is groundwater dependent. So everyone living in the valley needs reachable water in their wells without having to go dry or having to spend a fortune, which they don't have the backing that industry has to drill a new well, or having to go into combining systems and put in one well for many systems, and you're talking about a lot of money. So I like to see the minimum threshold be weighted more with the concerns of urban and residential wells. Also, this ties into groundwater dependent ecosystems, riparian habitats. If you go into use the minimum threshold for deeper wells, then you're impacting more of the sustainable criteria. So I just feel it hasn't been weighted enough, and I like to see that taken more into consideration. I think it also affects water quality in some of these systems. The water gets too low and they're getting into not very good quality because of the depth of their wells has diminished. So, so I like to put my 2 cents that when the minimum thresholds are talked about, that those urban and residential uses could be given more weight. And so in your data, when you were showing the years where wells were going dry, we need to know whose wells were going dry and where. Were they residential, were they ag, and where were they? So we need to see that kind of data. And then that might also influence where we have monitoring wells. So if we know what wells were going dry in those years, the uses, that would help us tremendous amount to figure out future steps. So I just, my 2 cents worth there. And thank you very much for the presentation today.
I appreciate that, Robin. Thank you. I do want to point out to people, Robin, you and everybody will have many more chances to get your 2 cents in. These are the types of questions we're going to be putting out in the survey. How much do you think we should weight domestic wells? That's going to be one of the ideas out there. And what Robin just did is exactly what we're looking for in these meetings, for people to say, this is what I think is important. That's exactly what drives our decisions here. and I appreciate that. We will have more opportunities in the sub-basin committee meetings to have exactly that discussion, Robin. Thank you.
Okay. All right, Bill. Light.
Hey, Derek, do you know what percentage of residential households are on domestic wells versus connected to a public water system? Because I think the vast majority of people are connected to a water purveyor that delivers, state approved water, drinking water to homes. Just wondering if you know that off the top of your
I
head.
do not know the percentage. What we did, Bill, in the 18400 aquifer subbasin is we said if we looked at all the well logs we could find there for domestic wells, and we did not have an indication of whether the well was still active or not, we just had the well logs. And we said if groundwater levels dropped to a certain level, how many of these wells would go dry? And there's a percentage that will go dry, but like I say, we don't know if they're active or not. We did make the assessment that it was not an unreasonably large number. So we did acknowledge that some wells might go dry, but we cannot manage to the shallowest well. That would be unreasonable to manage to the shallowest well in the basin. This is another point where there's going to be a discussion and a negotiation of what is an unreasonable amount of domestic wells. And I think, Bill, your point is one that's going to have to come into that discussion. What's an unreasonable amount of domestic wells that might be impacted if many people are hooked up to small systems, either small state or small local systems? I don't have those numbers as far as percentages, but I think that type of question is a good one to bring up, Bill.
Yeah, and I think the county might have some good data on that. I think Robin asked a good question. I mean, when I think of shallow wells that are problematic, I think of Prunedale. I think of Elkhorn Slough area. I think of I guess it'd be the east side, which is that Baranda area, Natividad area out beyond the city limits. Those are all kind of, well, I don't want to say problematic, but there's areas that have had issues. And I think those folks definitely deserve a fair shake on how we fix their problem. But I also think, and I'll just say this, the state's the one that's mandated, drinking water a human right, which I think is appropriate. And I think the state needs to step up. There's so much we can do here locally, but really the objective from the state's perspective, and I'm not putting this on your shoulders, Derek, but they made it a human right. They should put their money where their mouth is and connect all these small water systems to either a water purveyor or to some sort of system where they have a permanent connection and they can get off of their domestic wells into a permanent water source at an affordable price, I might add. So that's just an opinion I'm voicing. I think since everybody's here, it's a good one to voice. So thank you.
And Bill, since you bring it up, I will let people know DWR is struggling with this question. It is not straightforward for them. This is what I've heard through the grapevine. DWR is struggling with the question, if we acknowledge that some percentage of domestic wells will go dry, and it's a small percentage, but it's some percentage, have we done our due diligence? Are we violating someone's human right to water? Or have we done our due diligence and said this is reasonable and we cannot manage the groundwater basin to the shallowest well? And what is that cutoff for domestic wells? There are areas in the Central Valley which have said we are going to allow our water levels to drop another 200 feet. DWR is saying, have they really taken into account the human right to water? Maybe not, but I will let you know what I've heard. DWR is really struggling with this question as to what the right approach is in these GSPs. When we get to that discussion in the sub-basin committees, I will have more to say and possibly more guidance from my own opinion and my own experience on it. But it's a good question, Bill, and good things to think about.
Okay, not seeing any additional raised hands from sub-basin committee members. I'll go over to the public participants. And we have a question from Tom Versick.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the presentation. And I'm not sure this is a question, more of an observation, pushing what Mr. Kramer said just a little bit more, that in those instances, perhaps where there are certain areas where the wells respond differently for whatever hydrological reasons, is those might be appropriate candidates for management areas. That sometimes the granularity might be important. And of course, in the public, there's some discussion about the Arroyo Seco versus the rest of the forebay. But there could be other places, and I'm more familiar with the south, so I'm not going to guess anything about the northern end, but there could be places where, say, close to the river versus not near the river, where the hydrology really is different and the metrics need to be different, and they could work with each other. So I just bring that up as, which is absolutely no criticism of anything that has been presented. It's just an additional piece. When the specific SMCs are looked at, one could also look at multiple sets of SMCs, depending on how that comes out. That's all.
Excellent point, Tom. Thanks very much. And that this does come up in our subcommittee, in our sub-basin committee meetings, that we can have we can have these management areas, and I think you make a good point. It is worth looking at. And if someone makes a good case for having a management area, I'm not opposed to them. I would like a good case for them, though. Yeah.
Okay, and Tom Berg with DWR. Hey, Tom.
Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me. Derek, I'm on the side with, I think it was Maria. Your undesirable result chart did look a little extreme of an example, and I appreciate that for clarification. But the question I have, because we are looking at this into the future, and I still don't have a final set of reviews for you to say this is what DWR accepts. However, 15 years of continued decline, the question I have is, how do you foresee are the required 5-year reviews fitting in with DWR's guidance before you get to somewhere where it would be considered undesirable after 20 years? Meaning, by year 15, if it's still going down, is there something you should be providing, saying yes, our project's almost started, or we have other plans, or just trust us? Those are kind of the different layers I was wondering about to keep clear for a lot of the public.
Yeah, good, Tom, thanks for bringing that up. Because this question comes up every time I give this presentation. And remember, I said, see this chart of us dropping for 15 years, there's some hidden things behind this. One of the hidden things that I didn't discuss, I discussed it later, is that if you take that path, you have to show in your plan that this is your planned path. You have to show in your GSP, this is your planned path. You have interim milestones that go down for 15 years because you, in your plan, you know in those last 5 years, you are going to be able to rise up to wherever you wanted to get to. I agree that it is going to be something that DWR is going to keep questioning you on, saying, are you really on your path? And we're gonna have to say every 5 years, why, yes, see, we've already done CEQA. Now we've already done the design of this project. We're really on our path. It is a perfectly legal path to be on. I really don't see many of the sub-basins in the Salinas Valley being on that path. I used that for illustrative purposes. I don't see that many of our sub-basins being on that path. But some of the background that I didn't want to get into is, if you do take that path, you are absolutely right, Tom. You have to, it has to be a path that you know how you get to the end. It has to be a path that you know how long it's going to take to implement your projects, and there is an absolute way to get to your measurable objective at the end. Otherwise, DWR will be quite concerned. So a little of two sides there. I appreciate you bringing that up, Tom. I know it kind of shocks people, but it does for a reason, to point out you can take that path as long as you have a plan, a 20-year plan to get to sustainability. I am working in some basins where they are quite concerned about exactly that, Tom, where the discussions are going to be, well, we think our neighbor is just going to mine groundwater for 15 years and then walk away from all their agriculture, and just that's their plan for getting to sustainability. And I keep advising them, I wouldn't plan on that. I wouldn't go that way if I were you. But there are some people who are worried about exactly that concern, Tom, that the way to get to sustainability is just use all the water all at once, make all the money you can, and then walk away. Not my favorite approach. Yeah.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And I just wanted the clarification that as the groups are working together, they know it's just not, this will fit and DWR accept it. We want to have a working relationship over the next 5 years, because part of reviewing your reports are understanding your report. So the more I understand it, the easier our steps will be together for the next 20 years and not such a big, a guessing game. So thank you for that.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay, do we have any other comments or questions? All right, I don't see any raised hands. And I'll just, unless you have anything else you want to add, Derek?
No, I was just going to say, if this still does not make sense to people, you are welcome to reach out to me and ask me questions about how these terms work together. This is only one presentation on a series when we are providing data. Hopefully they all work together so you get in your mind a picture of how we are going to set SMCs. That's all I've got to say, and thank you all very much.
Okay, we've got 2 more questions just coming in, and I'll just.
I am going to be shorter in my wrap-up comments then from now on. Stop giving people these
people
options.
And I'll just have my closing comments, and then we'll go to these 2 other questions. But just to say that I'm looking forward to a lot more discussion about SMCs in the upcoming Subbasin Committee meetings. The next 2 meetings of the East Side and Upper Valley Subbasin committees will be dedicated to SMCs, and the next meeting for the other 3, Fort Bay, Monterey, and Langley, will be dedicated to SMC. So we'll be talking about this for the next couple months, and hopefully this workshop gave everybody more information to make those conversations even richer. But yes, please reach out with additional questions, and we will start with Robin. Are you?
Thank you. Derek, you're saying that water quality is the responsibility of other agencies, but I just don't see us working in isolation, that we will be working with these other agencies for win-win projects, where it helps us with our criteria, it helps them with their goals. So I just see us working in tandem with a lot of other agencies who we just have the same goals, but we have for different reasons. So I just don't see us working in isolation, but with other agencies as well. That's my comment.
Thank you, Robin. And you're right, we do, and we are reaching out to the other agencies to build relationships with them. I think my point, and maybe I didn't state it clearly enough, is we don't want to take on the authorities that we want to work with them, but we don't want to take on the authorities of these other agencies. We don't want to tread on their toes and say, please step aside, we'll take over for you right now. So working together, part of working together is to not supersede them. But you are right, the other part of working together is to move together towards sustainability that includes sustainable water quality. Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Robin. And Sarah Hardgrave, committee member, Sarah Hardgrave.
Yes, hi, thank you. This was a very informative presentation. It's taking me a little time to digest how this all works. My question is about the different subbasins and subcommittees in terms of the process for resolving any potential conflicts across subbasins. So my question is, do you foresee or expect instances where one subbasin committee might come up with one set of criteria that has an impact on another subbasin? And what will the process be for addressing those kinds of differences of strategies across the committees?
Good question, Ms. Hartgrave. There is a potential that could happen. We're actually in a slightly better position, I think, than many other subbasins, particularly in the San Joaquin Valley, because we are developing our GSPs together. And so we are alerted to those concerns coming up. I think in the San Joaquin Valley, you end up with people basins who aren't coordinating between themselves as much and are taking strong positions that possibly don't match up with their neighbors nearly as much. So I think they could come up some, but I don't see it as large. I see them as probably small differences. And the reason is there isn't a lot of opportunity in this valley to take an extreme and enforce an extreme SMC. It's going to be difficult to take and enforce a groundwater level, saying we want to lower groundwater levels 300 feet below where they are today. And it's difficult for a couple reasons. One, if you tried to do that in one of the coastal subbasins, you would just get seawater intrusion. And two, if you tried to do that in one of the upper or forebay subbasins, the river would just keep pouring water into your subbasin there. So we're not going to be in a situation where we have extreme differences, but we may have small differences. And I think that's going to, after that great introduction of mine, I am going to admit we do not have a formalized process right now for working out differences between them. I think one of the ideas is going to be, if people have different SMCs, we're going to have to say, can we develop projects and actions that incorporate all the SMCs, even if they're different in other basins? And if we get to a point where we say, no, the SMCs are too far apart that no matter what projects and actions we implement, we can't get them to match up, then there's going to be the point of we're going to have to negotiate between those two. But I will admit we don't have a formal process for that yet. And thanks for bringing that up. That will come up soon.
We do have a committee that's being established, though. So while we don't have a process, we do have a group of people where one of their roles will be to help work out those potential circumstances in the future. So that's the Integrated Sustainability Plan Committee.
And that committee may develop, could be requested as we move along to look at processes based on maybe some of these forthcoming conflicts or issues, Sarah. So, but that committee is sort of the body that we would like these kinds of things to eventually land in, with the intent of helping solve or have those discussions with referral back to the board.
Okay, all right. Committee member Leip.
Thank you. I'll come back to that. I had not heard of that board that's being thought of, but I'll ask in a minute. Derek, this goes to the competing agency thing. We have a couple different things going on here locally. We have the Regional Water Quality Board, we have the Water Agency of Monterey County that controls, controls quite a bit of water, and I think somebody's going to need to take the lead on this stuff. And my experience with the Regional Water Quality Board is they're not very effective. They have authority, they have far-reaching powers for sure, but in problematic areas, and they and again, this is just my opinion, they've dropped the ball. And I don't think they're just very much equipped to be able to deal with this stuff. And I think when it comes to water quality, and I've heard Robin and others talk about it, and Horacio and people in ag and everything, at some point that somebody's going to need to take the lead on this and be accountable. And I think it's us locally that probably can be a lot more effective in taking care of problematic areas with drinking water in some areas, especially on farmland. And then, you know, ratcheting it up with the legislators when it comes to, they're the ones that made these laws. You know, I can appreciate DWR's in a tough spot. They're basically in the same spot we're all in, is that this stuff all landed in our lap without a lot of forethought of how to actually do it. So I hope that we're open to, you know, either the county or the GSA at some point taking a step towards leading on water quality here in our area, because I just don't think anybody else outside of our area is really equipped to deal with it. And then I'm going to come back to this committee that just got mentioned. Who's going to be on that committee? How's that going to be selected? And are these going to be public meetings, agendized meetings where the public has a chance to witness how these potential conflicts, I guess you want to call them, are going to be worked out?
Yeah,
The
Bill,
plan bill is
the integrated. Go ahead, Emily.
no, but go ahead.
I was just going to say, Bill, the integrated sustainability planning committee. We've presented this several times in our planning process work that we've shown you at the board. We often refer to it as the ISP committee. And the board took action on approving and planning the planning work to seat that committee. And it's going to be comprised of one member of each subbasin planning committee. Emily, pitch in here. We've also got a member of the SWIG will be on that committee. We also have staff from Monterey County Water Resources Agency will be on that committee as technical providers. So this is a committee that we built into our planning process, which we discussed off and on over the past few months. And the idea is that this is the place where the 5 plans can be spoken about with concurrently as we're doing the planning work for these types of conversations. So this would be.
So is this going to be done after the GSPs are completed for each subbasin?
So the idea is that it'll be convened, and then they will meet as needed as the GSPs are getting developed. We don't have an official start date yet. And then it'll also be the committee that reviews the next chapters of the integrated plan as they are developed. And that is supposed to be completed after the GSPs are completed. But again, we don't have a date set yet because we are definitely putting all of our focus on the GSPs right now. So they will be convened as needed, but definitely before, if they're not needed to work out any problems between subbasins, then they will be convened to review the next chapters for the integrated plan. And the meetings will be public.
This is really this is the committee, Bill, that basically gets us to that valley-wide basin plan, which, when we started with our first planning effort with the 18400, that was sort of the ultimate goal we would be having an integrated plan whereby all the subbasin plans were sort of rolled into a comprehensive integrated plan. So we can do that product outside of the DWR deadline in terms of the high priority and medium priority basins. So your board, we will develop that work obviously during our subbasin planning work because we want that to be integrated, but finalizing and examining what that will look like in terms of implementation will be something the board will continue to work on past the immediate DWR deadline.
Thank you.
And committee member Kramers?
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you, Grant.
All right, super. Hey, Derek, another question for you. So in the event that 2 subbasins have a conflict, isn't that where we bring you and your expertise and your firm into this discussion? Wouldn't, if there is a conflict, wouldn't you guys be the people that kind of broker the dealing of it and get to the hydrology and science behind it and resolve those conflicts rather than a committee or a lawsuit or something?
I would say my role is to provide advice. It's not to broker a deal or settle a deal. Thanks for bringing up something that I love to say regularly, Grant. This is not, none of these plans are my plan. I am giving all the advice I can. I am trying to help things along through our scientific knowledge and through our knowledge of what had happened in other places. But it is the board of directors who gets the final say on everything there. And so do what I can. I appreciate your confidence in me, Grant, but it is the board of directors who gets to make their decision.
Okay, understood. But we can it is reasonable for us to turn to you guys for an objective review of the science that we know.
Absolutely. Be happy to do that. Yes.
Okay, committee member Amezquita.
I just want to make a comment. You know, the Salinas Valley is just one watershed. It may have some sub-basins, different basins, but it's for the benefit of everybody, agriculture, drinking water, that all sub-basins work together and not have any conflicts, because water flows just as one. And the way nature is that if we manage the water as a watershed, we can do better than just trying to manage water by dividing the subbasins. So I think the best way is that every subbasin within the GSA, we all have to work together in order to become more sustainable for water quantity and water quality. Thank you.
And Melissa, I just want to remind everyone that we need to stay on topic of the presentation and not stray too far away from Derek's PowerPoint in our comments for this portion.
Okay.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Horacio.
Okay. Any other questions or comments related to SMCs? Okay, I don't see any additional raised hands. I want to just thank everybody for their comments and questions. I think they make these workshops, I think, even more valuable to everybody participating. So thank you for that. And Derek, thank you as always for your wealth of information. And thank you all for joining us today.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
The meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Emily. Good save.
My first job clerking.
Good job, Emily. Thanks, everyone.